Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Vivid Ideas, Creators Get Mutual, here at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Sydney. Find an excellent position. You don't all have to be at the back. My name's Peter Tregelgas. I'm the curator and producer for this event. Thank you also for coming out, and what an incredible piece of Sydney weather, but don't we love it? My task, of course, is how, what, why, and when are we here, and what's the context. In the role of being the curator, the concept here is to bring the people together, bring some of the ideas together, I did that towards the end of last year when Vivid first put out a call for an expression of interest. But in order to get an understanding of that, it's important to probably get a little bit of an understanding about my own background, and that is that I come from a creative background. Festivals was my first interest, I'll go into that in a moment. But more importantly, it is relevant that we acknowledge today that we're on the land of the Eora people and the Eora nation, and that, of course, these are also the first artists. And I'd like to acknowledge the elders, past and present, and any Indigenous people who may be with us today. And to carry forward the concept of of trying to curate an event of this kind, when we talk about arts and culture, arts, of course, is a trading organisation. We do our work, we try and sell items for it, and that's important, and we also consider the scenario around the social enterprise focus. And social enterprise, of course, being about market-based ventures with social aims, and that market base is really important. Theatre people sell tickets to shows. Artists try and indeed sell their work to galleries and collectors. Performers try to sell their services. And what's important now is what we can do within the current environment to ensure that there is appropriate and good work for us all within the future. But one of the important things is about the structure and how we might go about that. Artists often work on their own, and the scenario of being collaborative or being connected, this is sort of second nature to artists, but not necessarily second nature in the terms of how they bring their business and bring their activities together. So one of the roles and one of the concepts here is about how artists can work together collaboratively and cooperatively. And that was really the basis that I went to the Business Council of Cooperatives and Mutuals and asked them to consider being the key associate to make this program come together. And I am so pleased that so many people have taken up that opportunity today, and particularly considering the weather that we've got. As many have been sandbagged in, so those that are here, it's congratulations to you, and also to us, of course, for bringing this together. Some of the events, of course, in terms of the festivals, is how did these things come about? When we started with small things. In the early 80s, 1980s, it tells you how old I am, I was the director of the Adelaide Fringe. In those days, it was a very small alternative affair. But of course, the role was to bring together those artists in that showcase. And we did that by what we call mainstreaming. We connected with mainstream media. We connected with mainstream business to get sponsorship in order to take the next step on. Now, how did I get interested in cooperatives was that fringe, the first 1980 fringe that I was involved in. The first sponsor I ever had was the South Australian Association for Credit Unions, and which was a group of credit unions, a group of individuals, but of course part of that process was learning who these people were, learning what the concept of a mutual actually was, and how appropriate was that in the context of that alternative fringe. From there, years on, I was fortunate to work for United Care Wesley in Adelaide, and where I was a social enterprise manager, and we produced a definitive booklet around social enterprise in Australia. And in fact, that definition of market-based ventures with social aims came from that. The idea that the social is important, but the market was also incredibly important. The ability to actually trade and build sustainability and employment. And that's again where I connected with cooperatives, because in that sense, cooperatives we saw as one of the categories within the concept of a broader social enterprise. And as we talk about now, it's also about what's the language that we're using. Because in that social enterprise, it sort of captured a lot of that buzz and the groovy nature of that social focus within a corporate context. As we're now also facing that challenge of the new sharing economy, and is that actually sharing? So one of the arguments, of course, and one of the important challenges that we have today is about whether we as creatives, in that context, can we look to the platforms of the future, look to the technology of the future, and actually collaborate and actually build that market opportunity for ourselves. The notion around cooperatives, of course, everyone has a reasonable understanding that around, say, producer cooperatives of farms, where the farmers will get together and particularly pool their resources or their produce in order to manage their market, to get a better price for their goods. Again, the same challenge around the arts, about how we get together and manage our own markets and make those improvements. So the role we have today was to bring together some of those players and bring together people with inspiration about what is this new concept of the platform cooperative, but also understand what's the purpose behind the task and the business that we're in. So I know you're welcome and you'll really enjoy the speakers as we work through them today, because of course the society that we make is of course around how we organise. And how we organise, if we remember, one of the issues around being a cooperative is it's a legal model. It's like a proprietary limited, but it's about how people come together. It's an entity, but it's important that it's a legislated model of governance in terms of that entity. So that was my challenge. This is what we've brought together for today and tomorrow. There's a further workshop for the day where our key speakers will be involved. I encourage you to attend if you haven't already registered. And without any further talk from me, please, I'd like to ask our moderator, MC of Extraordinaire, to take the stage. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you. Thanks, Peter. Hello, everybody. Again, can I echo my congratulations? You're all heroes for making it across sea, road, rail, or any other terrain to get here. My name's Tim Horton. I'm an architect by training. I'm interested in the design of buildings and the spaces in between. I'm also interested in the design of systems that we use and rely on every day. And I know that if we can design systems, we can also redesign systems. I remember a conversation I had with someone in 2008 standing on the dance floor of a chateau in France. He was a merchant banker from Wall Street. And this thing called the credit crunch had just emerged, just broken in the news. And he was convinced that, in fact, it was just that mum and dad had bought one or too many TV screens. It was overconsumption, and the market would correct. Mum and dad would stop buying TVs, so many TVs, and we'd all go back to a more sustainable economic model. Only that didn't happen, and we had this thing called the global financial crisis. And what happened there was a lot of the economies got thrown up, and they are still arguably in the process of being remodelled. If you haven't already worked out, I'm going to be taking you through a series of gigantic generalisations and leaps of logic and ask you not to critique any time along the way. I'm the son of the former head of a department called the Department of Housing and Cooperatives. And as a 7- and 8-year-old, I was dressed in a green velour jumpsuit. There are photos of this around, let me tell you, not on the net yet. At the opening of friendly societies, at the opening of food co-ops, at the opening of housing co-ops. So I wonder how much of my approach to seeing architecture very much as a social and public good comes from an underlying understanding that they also came from those who opted to work together with financial arrangements that allowed them to do it, and even I don't know anyone who's tried to get a co-op housing model going in your neighbourhood, but our land economy is not suited to it. Our subdivision models are not suited to it. We don't make it particularly easy for people. I was yesterday at the Factory Design District. I don't know if you've been, 901 Burke Street. Fantastic little assemblage of creatives who were there, textile makers, furniture makers, ceramicists, wood turners, etc. There are these hints of networks that exist. I think creatives are very good at the collaborative model. A great studio called 49 was offering a fantastic espresso cup. This is a total plug. With a beautiful ceramic espresso cup with a beautifully turned saucer. The saucer was done by Sarah Kay, the artist, and together they worked on, developing the product, sharing the profits. It was a great little example. I would argue again, second leap of faith and generalisation is that I think the creative sector understands the concept of sharing quite naturally because the process of conceiving, delivering, selling, marketing, learning, doing it all again is intensely collaborative, and you need help along the way. Not just in 901 Burke Street, we see this in financial co-ops that are providing microfinance. We see land share arrangements where land is lent for those who want to produce food. We see the collaborative economy, the sharing economy, the social economy emerging. It's been described as the civic economy. It's being described as the fusion between Web 2.0 and civic purpose, a new civic that we're discovering. That yes, technology allows to make possible, but it's not technology alone. Where have these models come from? This is important. Are they brand new? The models trace back many hundreds of years. Interestingly, in relation to the last great revolution, the Industrial Revolution. There's a great story about 28 weavers who got together to pool their resources so that they could afford and others could afford what they found hard, the means of everyday living. Through that, we get mutuals and cooperatives. Today, we get new terminology, and maybe today's event is about connecting new terminology with models that exist here and around the world. And it's important to understand that this is as much about finance as it is about the legal frameworks, as it is about the legislative and policy backing that we give to these business models. There is a point where the emergent becomes mainstream, and that is a point where we mature into the policies, pathways, the programs that are there to assist those who are operating in this emergent field. Today we're going to be joined by those outside the room as well, those who Peter described as being sandbagged in by the weather. So I'm not asking you, please don't turn off your phones, turn them to silent if you would, unless it's an extremely clever ringtone, but generally we don't have those yet. Creatives Get Mutual is the hashtag, acknowledging Lisa Colley in the room from the City of Sydney. Creative Sydney is another fantastic hashtag that we can use as well, and Vivid Ideas is the way of telling people across Vivid what it is that we're actually doing. The creative economy is recently back in frame in the New South Wales government. There was a report produced only a few months ago that says it's worth $500 million to the New South Wales economy. 45,000 people are employed in the social economy. Importantly, half of New South Wales residents are involved in that economy, and PwC reports that from 2013 to 2014, participation doubled. So we are beginning to see this exponential growth in people understanding and participating in the sharing economy. Does that mean everything is open? Does it mean everything is social? No. There are dark sides emerging from the social economy as well, where we are seeing profits generated, but shipped offshore to investors. So not everything in the social economy maybe is what it seems to be. This brings into frame our speakers today. We're going to hear first from Janelle Orsi, who's a lawyer, attorney from Oakland, California, a place that doesn't receive much rain, a place that goes to the polls in the California primary on Tuesday, I'm told. We have our own election happening at the same time here in Australia. These things are intensely political, and it's important for us to have a position on that as a community. Following Janelle will be James Chin Moody, a man known to many of you. His book, Sixth Wave, was a fantastic one that I read a few years ago and tried to convince everybody in the South Australian government to read it. And again, it's about stepping back and saying there is a trend going on here. This is a thing. We will be joined after that by Melina Morrison, who's the CEO of the Business Council of Cooperatives and Mutuals, and by Nuno Silva, who is from Stocksy, a Canadian cooperative based in photography. So with that, I'm going to invite Janelle Orsi up. Janelle is an attorney, a mediator who works with local communities, not-for-profits, cooperatives. In 2010, she was profiled by the American Bar Association and called a rebel lawyer. I think that's fantastic. And who is working to reshape law in the spirit and through innovation. Janelle.
Thank you, everybody. So I have drawn some cartoons. I thought I'd bring my creative self today. And also just to make it vivid, why I love cooperatives so much and how I think we can all create them. So I also like to come up with slogans. I'm always testing out new slogans for the cooperative revolution. So cooperatives, putting the lively back in livelihoods. And I believe it's true because I've been able to experience it firsthand. So there's myself and my coworkers at the Sustainable Economies Law Center in Oakland. So we're very lively people. We have put the lively back in livelihood. We're about half of us are lawyers, half of us are not. We are all activists, and we also operate like a cooperative. So we have a very carefully crafted governance structure that gives everybody a lot of power and autonomy. We all make the same salary, no matter who we are and how long we've been there, which gives everybody a great sense of ownership. And we've been doing this for close to 4 years now. And I love it. I love cooperatives. And having experienced it in this way, also it's the thing that makes me feel kind of deep in my bones that it's possible and it's going to be great. Cooperatives are going to be great. One of the problems with cooperatives, though, is they just sound so nice, you know? People, you tell them that you help cooperatives, they think, yeah, that sounds really nice. People cooperating, that's a good thing. But cooperatives are so much more than that. They're revolutionary. They're going to change the flow of wealth in society. They're huge. And we also need to create cooperatives as if our lives depended on it, because I think our lives depend on it, which I will explain. I used to draw sharks to represent what I consider to be the mainstream economy, the conventional business structures, but then somebody told me it's kind of insulting to compare conventional businesses to sharks, mainly insulting to sharks. So now I draw a square, which makes a lot of sense to me because I've begun to feel like the conventional economy, it's very square. It's become a little bit boring and predictable. Everything's kind of mathematically calculated to come out. And there are these rules that we've just applied consistently across conventional businesses. And I'm very familiar with these rules because I read the boring rules and bylaws of companies. And one of the biggest rules that I'm so tired of is just that the highest bidders win. If you have money and you can bid higher than somebody else to buy a company, to buy land, you're probably going to get that land or get that company because highest bidders win. And this means that, okay, I tried to draw Australian money. It means that if you have money, you get power. It means that if you have money, you also get the profits. The number of shares you own in a company, that determines the size of your vote. It determines the amount of the profits you get. So money rules everything, which it starts to feel suspiciously like our economy is Monopoly. It's like the actual board game of Monopoly, where when you start to accumulate money, then you get more, and then you buy a hotel on Boardwalk, and then your wealth just keeps growing. And don't get me wrong, I love Monopoly. And I also kind of, there's a lot about our economic system that's fun, because you kind of think, maybe I'll win, maybe I'll be one of those people that makes a lot of money if I work really hard, if I'm in the right place at the right time, and so on. And so we've been playing that way for a long time, and everybody plays. But there does come a point where, okay, someone's got a hotel, and then they get another hotel, and then they just start to, people just start dropping out of the game. The biggest players eat the next largest, and so on, to the point where at some point you realize, well, first of all, this is getting a little too real for comfort, because in our society, well, the game is about to be over. I mean, we've been playing this for a long time, but at some point we realize, wait, Monopoly always ends. Well, it either ends or somebody just goes and throws the board on the floor in frustration. But either way, you come to a point where wealth has come to be concentrated in the hands of few. And here's global wealth, where 20% of all the wealth, the top 20% of people in the world control 94.5% of the wealth. So you can sort of see where this is about to go. It's that point in Monopoly where one person's got, 20% of the people have all the hotels, and the vast majority of the rest of us are working with just a very small amount. It's like we have a house on Baltic Avenue, and that's all we're hanging on to. So we know the game is about to be over. But I think we have options. It's the rules of Monopoly that are flawed. And so I'm a lawyer. I get to think about rules. So how are we going to change the rules of the economy? How are we going to change laws? How are we going to change bylaws, the rules of our organizations? And I realized, I don't want this mathematical formula to predict our future. I don't want our fate to be determined by the way that this math is going to play out. But when you're not going to let the highest bidders control everything and determine everything, then it's like, okay, now what? Now what's going to determine everything? All right, we don't have this math that's going to work it all out for us. So who or what is going to determine everything? It's people. We have people who can figure it out. We have the power of reason. We are social. We can come together, and we can make decisions about what we want to do with all this wealth. We still have a lot of wealth to work with, and we can make it multiply just by sharing it. And so it's people who can come together and make those decisions, and that's where cooperatives come in, because cooperatives, there are two things built into the rules of cooperatives. They're inherently built in that make it different. One is, money doesn't buy you power in a cooperative. Being a person, participating in the cooperative is what gives you power. It's a one-member, one-vote system. And then money doesn't determine how much of the profits you're going to get. So money doesn't turn into more money. People generate profits, and we share them, usually on the basis of what's called patronage, how much you've worked for the cooperative, how much you consumed for the cooperative, your actual participation, not how wealthy you were to begin with. So those two rules just change the entire way that cooperatives think. It's a completely set of ethical values, and it means that I call them old school companies now. They're still the conventional company, but if we start calling them old school, they eventually maybe will be. But conventional companies, for example, workers, they pay workers as little as they can get away with. Because they need to generate as much as they can for their shareholders, whereas a cooperative doesn't have shareholders profiting off the work of workers. So cooperatives try to give back as much as they can to workers. They're inherently designed to not generate a profit for anyone, so they generate a surplus of wealth. It's just like, okay, we're going to give it all back. So it's just turning the rules completely upside down and redirecting the flow of wealth back out to everybody. So the game is not over. We just need to change the rules. We just need to throw that board away and start working with a new set of rules. But there are all these naysayers. People think, people, they're never going to change. Everyone's very motivated by money. They're not going to get together and cooperate. And then people think, well, also, who's going to be even motivated to start cooperatives? I mean, people are always motivated to start companies, startups, because you're going to eventually become a billionaire if you start a company. But if you're not going to become a billionaire by starting a cooperative, like what on earth is going to motivate you? So back to the square. I think what people are often assuming, the naysayers, as I was calling them, is that we as people are kind of single-faceted, that we've kind of come to orient ourselves toward one thing. Well, I use US dollars in this case. But yeah, that's really all we're focused on. And it's true that we focus on that a lot because we live in times where our survival depends on money. And our survival does depend on money because as a society, we have all collectively agreed that this is one of the ways we want to transact with each other. So we are oriented toward money. But we only need to be to a point. We don't need to go to excess, to the point where we are accumulating way more than we even need and spending it on ridiculous things that are destroying the planet. And so I actually think that we have more facets than this one, monetary orientation. This is not going to be the best drawing of the show. But we We are disco balls. We are not single-faceted individuals. We have a lot of different facets. We have a ton of them because we are very interesting people. And we are oriented toward people. We like children. We like each other. We like to have fun. We like to do things together. We like the earth. We like love. We like nature. And those things are highly motivating to people. So I'm relying on the multifaceted quality of human beings to save the world. And so I'm going to introduce another word here. This is a framing that I've begun to use, which is that of the commons. And I think throughout time, throughout the world, people have managed their resources with a very different frame of mind, a different frame of mind than highest bidder takes all, which is the commons, which I'll explain. But first I have to acknowledge that for so many years I could not get sheep out of my head. You know, I always thought, commons, what is that? Is that like a big grassy area where people graze their sheep? Well, yes, it is. It is a place where people it is a resource that people share to make their livelihoods. And this, the one slide that got messed up. Anyways, but this is a definition of commons that I've come to find really useful. Because what it tells me, it's not just land and sheep. That's not what commons are about. We can actually take any resource, whether it's water, whether it's technology, housing, and treat it as a commons if we, as groups of people, work together, make decisions together to allocate those resources with the goal of providing for people and sustaining our communities in the long term. So we have all these new criteria on which we can make decisions, and that to me is the commons. And so I'll give some tips on how I think we can actually create commons that will sustain us in the long term, and what that looks like in our legal structures. But yes, platforms. So that's been a theme. It comes up a lot, and one of the things that we want to talk about at this event today. But so many of us have come to rely on technology to make our livelihoods. Even if we're not interacting with it every day, at some level, there's technology controlling everything, how we consume, how we communicate, how we work. A lot of people are now not employed. They are independent business owners who are making their livelihoods by connecting with clients through the internet. And so metaphorically, they are grazing their sheep on this technology. And so one option is to have this technology owned by a few billionaires who are generating massive amounts of profits for themselves and controlling everything. Or the other option is to treat technology as a commons, because this is where we metaphorically graze our sheep. This is what sustains us. It gives us access to the means to make a livelihood. So what we should do, probably would be a little more wise, is to manage it so that we all have access and can sustain ourselves in the long term. And I also I find validation in the fact that there are these Nobel Prize-winning economist types who agree with that and say people throughout time have been able to create commons. They've been able to do it successfully in the long term, and that there are lessons we can learn. And so Elinor Ostrom received the Nobel Prize for studying commons all over the world and finding that there are certain principles and practices that she saw across commons, whether it was fisheries or grazing lands or any kind of resource, that those principles and practices sustain the commons in the long term. And so these are principles that I've begun to learn from as a lawyer and begun to implement even when I'm forming a technology cooperative. One of the things that I've learned from Elinor Ostrom and from Commons is that commons are places where we bring our whole selves to work. We bring our whole selves to the table because each of us individually has to participate. Like each of us, there's not passive participants in commons. We're all taking part because there are decisions being made everywhere that affect each of us individually. So we each need to show up and take part in the commons. What should we be making? What should we be managing as commons? Well, I usually answer that question by just saying, well, what are the things that we rely on to survive? Just fill in the blank. Anything can be managed as a commons, but what we need to start doing is thinking about any time that there is a middleman, quote unquote, somebody standing in between us and the thing we rely on for our livelihoods. Anytime there's somebody between us and they're there to make maximum profits for themselves, we need to consider that a problem because it's not going to play out well in the end. And so we already have a situation where water has been privatized all over the world. There are land grabs everywhere. A lot of really key resources that we rely on to survive have already been grabbed up by the wealthy, and that's depressing, although I'm optimistic, and I'll tell you why. But here's the thing about creative people, and anyone who relies mainly on their own labor, their services, to make a livelihood, is if there is a middleman standing between you and your audience, between you and your customers or clients, then you're not stuck with that middleman. Because what's standing on the other side is other people, and people can make choices to go elsewhere, and what they need to do is just meet each other in a different place, which is a cooperative. And I know that we can do this, particularly in the realm of creativity, in the realm of service work, because what the middlemen had, or like in the case of a lot of these technology platforms that have become intermediaries for labor, they really only have a couple things, and we can get them. One is technology. I wrote some code for y'all. It's really not code at all. But anyways, they have the code. They have the technology. They also have the captive attention of a lot of people. There's all these people who have Uber installed on their phone and who are using it every day. And Uber, what did they say? It's worth like $80 billion now? Uber doesn't own anything. All they own is some technology and the captive attention of a bunch of people. And so I'm actually very optimistic that we can get people to shift their attention elsewhere. Well, one of the pieces of good news is that we can clone technology now so much more easily than we could before. Not literally copy and paste in most cases, but a lot of these platforms, now that the business model has been proven, now that everybody understands what Uber and ride sharing is all about, we can create other platforms that do the exact same thing. Well, here's an example of one in the US that's become quite big, TaskRabbit. So it's a website where people can go online, find someone to clean your house, find someone to do deliveries for you, and pay them. TaskRabbit, by the way, takes 30% of the earnings of each of these quote-unquote rabbits, the people who provide the services. They take 30% of the earnings. So one of the clients of the Sustainable Economies Law Center is Loconomics. Notice that all websites now have these giant photographs right up top. So, I mean, they're literally cloning each other. But here's Loconomics. It might look a little familiar. Look, you can find people to come clean your house or take care of your kids. But here's the difference. Same technology, same capabilities. This one is a marketplace owned by the people who do the work. It's owned by the house cleaners and the massage therapists. Or I should say it will be. We've converted it to a cooperative. We bought out. There were 11 shareholders. They converted their stock to promissory notes. We've amended the bylaws so many times because actually, as I was just talking to Nuno about, it's so complicated to figure out how a giant cooperative is going to operate, and we keep coming up with new ideas. But the point is the technology is ready, the bylaws are about ready, and what we need now is people to be using it. But this is good news because I think people, they have short attention spans. They might all be obsessed with Uber or TaskRabbit or these platforms right now, but we can organize people. Coincidentally, we can use the internet to organize them because they're already using the internet. So it's just a 4-step process. Organize people, sort of grow their cooperative literacy, let them know what other options are out there. Collectively leap to new platforms, delete the old ones, why not? And repeat with all kinds of platforms. So pretty soon, as these platforms come to exist, we can organize ourselves and we can be off Uber within, days. We could be off all of these major platforms within days. So it's very exciting. So there's a lot of good news. I have more good news. Another thing about creatives is if you're a creative person, you're a producer of whatever you produce, you're also a consumer. You probably also listen to music and watch movies and things, which is different than other kinds of services. Like if you're an Uber driver, you might not also take Uber that much. Maybe you do. But so what that means is that creatives can organize cooperatives. They can be both on the consumer side and the producer side and make agreements that, okay, we're going to start using new platforms. They can start to grow critical masses. or I should say we, because look, I'm creative too. But anyways, so we can start to grow a critical mass of people who say, forget the middleman, let's create our own cooperatives. Let's only use cooperatively owned platforms to download music, to buy crafts, to buy clothing and whatnot. Other piece of good news is this is going to be fun, mainly because it has to be fun, or I don't think it's going to work. And one of the reasons is that, I know people want me to stand up here like a square and be like, yes, cooperatives are more efficient and stable and more competitive than other businesses, which is true. I think in the long term, that's going to be very true because you're not having to generate profits for that middleman. But right now, it's going to be hard because it's like we're playing Monopoly, and then we've plunked down a cooperative in the middle of this game where the rules are completely different for everything else. That cooperative is going to struggle because we're all still struggling in the sort of conventional Monopoly game. So I think cooperatives, it's going to feel like, as we're starting cooperatives, it's going to feel like we're pushing a heavy ball up a hill because a lot of things they're not organized in our favor. Financing is hard to get. Legal structures are confusing. There's just not a lot of cooperative literacy in society as a whole. There are just a lot of things against us, although I do think we will reach a tipping point where there are enough cooperatives and enough enthusiasm about it that it becomes easier. But in the meantime, it's not going to be that easy, which is what tells me it has to be fun, because people will do things for fun that are not convenient, they're not cheap. You can go, I've stood in line all day just to get into a concert, to pay for a very expensive ticket while standing in the cold, not because it's cheap or convenient, but because it's fun. People are so motivated by fun that we'll probably do we'll go out of our way to use cooperatives and build a whole new economy if it's fun. Oh, look, there's us having fun again. We do actually have a lot of fun. My coworkers just have a great sense of humor, and it honestly, we do a lot of hard work. We work really hard. We do legal work. It's super serious sometimes, but we're motivated because we do have so much fun. Anyways, other piece of good news is that it's going to feel meaningful, and because it has to be. Again, I think people are motivated to get out on the streets, do things that are not convenient, not cheap, not comfortable, because it's meaningful to them. So cooperatives, they're just going to be great. More news, good news, also for creatives, is that we're going to especially need creatives more than many other kinds of professionals to transition to a cooperative economy because our brains have been hardwired for the current square economy. There's a sort of a scarcity mentality that's so ingrained in our minds that we're constantly going to be slipping back into our old ways of doing things, our competitive ways, our insatiable drive to accumulate is going to always be there, at least in the back of our minds, but we can begin to retrain our minds. Our brains are very versatile, and we can create new pathways. But art and design and film and media, these are going to play a huge role in beginning to shift the way that we think and to change our culture. So creatives are going to be leaders in this revolution. Okay, and here's the last, another piece of good news is just that as we build platform cooperatives, which I think may be one of the easiest forms of cooperatives to create and scale, as we begin to grow membership in these cooperatives, we've built people power, and people power can be very useful for other things, such as trying to take back the earth from the big corporations that are destroying it. Taking back land and taking back water, it's not going to be easy, and we have to build people power. So if we're able to build people power through platforms, that is preparing us to change the economy in so many other ways. So I was trying to create a new little hashtag. I don't actually use Twitter that well, but there are a lot of things that should be cooperatives, and it becomes like a game. You look around at everything in society and think, that should be a cooperative, this should be a cooperative. I'll start with some low-hanging fruit. There are a lot of websites that creatives have begun to rely on to make their livelihoods. Etsy. Do you all use Etsy here? There's a little bit of nodding going on. So yeah, people sell their handmade goods on Etsy. It's now publicly traded on Wall Street in the United States. It's too far gone. We're not going to turn it into a cooperative. We can clone it and create a different one, though, because we don't need to be paying Etsy a percentage of our earnings as creatives. I'm just giving you an example of this is somebody's store with their cat book. Anyways, we don't need Etsy. We can create cooperatives for that. This is another site I've been using lately to support creative people who I feel like they need support because they're so dang talented, and I don't want them to have to go get a day job. I want them to be creative all the time. So it's called Patreon. And what you can do is you can either pay people a certain amount per month, or you can pay them a certain amount per creation or per song that they record. And this is a journalist who writes a lot about the sharing economy, but she writes in cartoons, so of course I love her. And so each time she creates something, I can't remember how much I donate, something like $10. So that should be a cooperative. Why do we need a company in the middle taking a percentage of her earnings and of the amount that I'm paying her? You know, transferring money, it's just like turning the 0 into a 1 here. It doesn't cost money. We don't need middlemen taking large portions of it. So, and all of these cooperatives will become easier and easier to build as we create an ecosystem of cooperatives. So the labor market cooperative that I helped to start, Loconomics, well, that I converted to a co-op, eventually should be using a cooperative web hosting platform, a cooperatively owned payment processing platform, and all of these things are going to eventually make the whole process of starting cooperatives much easier. But there's still this question in everyone's mind, and really mine. I've been working with cooperatives for 9 years as their lawyer. I've seen so many failures that it gets depressing sometimes, but I just obsess all the time about what is it that makes them work. And I feel like I've discovered some things that do, in fact, make them work, and it feels right. It feels like this is really possible. So there are a few things about cooperatives, as I mentioned, these 2 things that are already built into the legal DNA of cooperatives that, as it is, makes them operate much differently. So people have power, people have profits, but one of the major challenges of cooperatives that you have to deal with is people. People are the worst. People are so complicated. And so, you know, a lot of people think of cooperatives and they think, oh my God, we're going to have to do so many long meetings, it's going to be miserable. And this is where legal structure can really help. I call it the tyranny of structurelessness. Actually, there's a famous essay called Tyranny of Structurelessness, which is that, you know, these cooperatives, they're not going to just be built on peace and love. They need structure. People need to know what their rights are and how to exercise their voice and what they can do, and you need structured meetings. Otherwise, you get the tyranny of structurelessness wrecks. This is me and my bad jokes. But it's basically certain people will have a greater sense of entitlement than others to take control. It's like it's bad habit we've all developed in this economy is this desire to seek power over others. And we do that. It's like a natural tendency we have. So we can create structures that kind of keep that tendency at bay. And again, I like to throw this photo up. I guess I'm homesick, but anyways, my coworkers, we have incredibly structured meetings, very structured. But what it does is it gives everybody a voice. It keeps us very efficient. And yeah, it's good. So structure. This is a bench. I was trying to come up with a metaphor for cooperatives and the commons. We create legal structures for them so that they're solid, so that they don't just disintegrate, so they don't get swallowed up again by the market, so we can rely on them. So we build firm provisions into their legal structures. But benches aren't really that comfortable in the long term. What we want is sofas. It's the soft part of commons and cooperatives. That's what really makes them work. It's the relationships we build, it's the trust we build, it's the fun we have. You know, as a lawyer, I have to do everything so carefully and precisely that when I draw cartoons and make slides, I draw a terrible sofa and I make a typo, and it's just kind of liberating, so bear with me there. Anyways, but yeah, it's the soft part. But you can't build a sofa without building a strong frame underneath. And it's that strong frame that allows you to begin to build the softer parts, to begin to build the relationships that you can rely on in the long term, and know that this cooperative is here to stay. So back to Loconomics, our client, the platform co-op. Into their bylaws, a few things that we built in are Loconomics is not for sale. So if some big corporation like Google or Uber or all these billionaires, they could easily come along and say, Loconomics, now that you have 100,000 members and you're so successful, we'll buy you for $1 billion. And there will be people who will think, oh my gosh, $1 billion, I could really use $1 billion right now. Or, divided among 100,000 people, that's still a lot of money for everybody. So what we need to do is make sure we're not going to just fall into that old habit of trying to get short-term gain, sacrificing the long-term benefit that a cooperative can provide workers. So in the bylaws, Loconomics is not for sale. Not only is it not for sale, if we do sell it, almost all the proceeds are going to go to a nonprofit organization and not to the members. Each member can get up to $1,000, or on average $1,000. But after that, everything goes to a nonprofit. Also, any decision to sell the cooperative is very, very hard to make. You've got to get a lot of people's approval. You need majority of the members. You need my approval as an individual. There are individuals out there who have the veto power over any attempt to sell it. So another thing is we put caps on extraction, caps on how much people can just take and take, because people do have this insatiable drive to accumulate wealth. It's not like people get to like $1 million and think, I have enough wealth now, I'm just going to stop earning. Otherwise, we wouldn't have billionaires. But so we put a cap on how much employees can make as salaries. It's 3 times the median wage in the San Francisco Bay Area. It's about $190,000 is the cap. So we're not going to have any fat cats up in the CEO office. In fact, there's not even a CEO. But anyways, we also, anyone who lends money, we haven't taken any capital at this point. Well, we have investors who now have promissory notes, but we've put a cap on how much they can get as a return on their loans. It's a pretty low cap. Something like 10%, but it's actually much lower than that, what they're actually getting. So yeah, because there's always this drive to keep getting more and more and more, so you just gotta put some legal boundaries around it. So polycentricity, I don't like using big words, but I just like this one, and I can translate it from English into English, which is that it means it's creating many centers of power within the organization. So Loconomics is required to create many centers of power, to create regional opportunities to participate in regional governance. Certain kinds of service providers like house cleaners can create groups to make decisions around what the platform does for house cleaners. They can come up with ideas for trainings. And so there's a constant obligation for the board of directors and for the staff to be pushing power outwards, pushing decisions to the level at which they are most relevant to the people who are affected by those decisions. So pushing power to the level of the individual, where any individual who takes part in the cooperative can come up with an idea or see a problem that they want resolved and have some power to do something about it. Because hierarchies are just so inefficient. If they see room for improvement, and if they have to go to somebody who has to go to somebody above them and somebody above them to get it approved and then have it come back down again, it's so unsatisfying and very inefficient. So staff trusteeship is another thing. It's a phrase that I've created to describe the employees of the cooperative each of them having a high level of responsibility and duty to be very responsive to the members. The members, there could be tons of them all over the place, but each staff member is obligated to be tuned into their needs, to be listening to what it is they want and helping to implement that. So the governance structure within Loconomics for staff is also very decentralized. What it does is it gives each staff person a lot of power to say, this is what I think we need to do to benefit this group of members. And what's interesting is I think that Stocksy has some similarities in how, you're going to hear from Nuno in a minute about Stocksy, but where staff, it seems, have a lot of power and a lot of autonomy to be serving the interests of the members of the cooperative. Just a quick mention about our legal system. One of the things I've learned as a lawyer is our entire legal system, our policies, our regulations, they are oriented to a type of economy that assumes that people are there to earn money and keep accumulating and exploiting others and extract as much as they can. And when you try to create a cooperative or build commons within that legal system, you just hit barriers at every step of the way and things that don't make sense, and it's difficult and it's discouraging if you're a cooperative. So all of that is to say we need to change a lot of laws. I'm not going to get into them today, maybe during conversations tomorrow. But add it to your to-do list. We need to change everything. We need to change a lot of laws. Everybody needs to be involved, because if everyone is not involved, we're not going to create an economy for everyone. So we're all going to participate. There's me in the future. I'm already part of at least one cooperative. I want a cooperative for everything. That's the thing that's going to bring me into the future. Me accumulating wealth is not the thing that's going to carry me through the future. It's the social connections and the organizations that I help to build. And best of all, we're not going to all die. We're not going to all destroy the planet because, here's my last bad joke. What is the opposite of an apocalypse? Here it comes. It's bad. A co-apocalypse. Co-apocalypse is coming. Thank you.
Thank you, Janelle. Thanks, Janelle. I do like that. I think anytime you give a microphone to an American, there's just something magical. I think the microphones were built for Americans, but more than that, there was so much in that. We're used to the TED format, but what we don't get from TED, I think, is the depth and in some ways the how-to. So we're going to explore that a bit in the panel discussion a bit later, and I know that'll be happening tomorrow as well. The how-to. I want to talk also a bit with Melina on the panel, heads up Melina, about the idea of cooperative business schools. Maybe it's just that we don't know enough about what the complexion of these things actually are. You can connect with Janelle on Twitter. This is a cooperative to get Janelle back on Twitter. She hasn't tweeted for a year. Janelle Orsi. You can also hear Janelle on Radio National on Tuesday with Life Matters and I understand Big Ideas as well. So it's great to have that happening. Next, I'm going to introduce James Chin Moody. He's an engineer. He's got background in innovation theory and systems engineering. One of the things about James, not only do I have a man crush on James, I'm not going to look at you, James. It's too deep. It's too deep-seated. Is I used one of James's share platforms to share when I was moving between homes and worked really well. But I didn't realise that James had helped between 1999 and 2001 to develop the systems engineering for Australia's first satellite in 30 years, which was launched, called FedSat. So he's done that bit too. He's a serial founder and entrepreneur. He sat on every major body that we have admiration for, the Bureau of Statistics. Were you on? Bureau of Meteorology. So James will also give us a short exegesis on what's happening outside as well. Many things about James. I mentioned his six-wave book the other at the top of this, which he co-authored with Bianca Nogrady. James is going to talk really about waves of innovation and how we see these things working at a meta level and what the megatrends are operating in the world. James, thank you very much.
Thanks, Tim. Well, thank you very much, Tim. And look, it's a delight and an honour to be here with you. Tim probably could have summed up my introduction by saying, this is James, he's actually a bit of a nerd. Because indeed, that's what I am. And I hope you'll forgive me today, I'm going to nerd out a little bit with you. Because my background is in innovation theory. But what is innovation theory? And it's interesting, Janelle was sort of starting to take us into this. It's actually the theory of change. And in particular, it's the theory of technological change. And how structures, how technology, how even marketplaces can actually start to shape the future. So in terms of context, and try to set ourselves up for both the conversation and maybe tomorrow, what I wanted to do is share with you some of the thoughts around what is actually happening at the moment in terms of change and where those changes are going to affect us in the future. But before I do that, I'd actually like to start with a little bit of a scenario. One of the first things they do in innovation theory is they tell you a very important, almost truism: timeframes matter. Sometimes when you do things is just as important as what you do. And to give you an example of this, and it can actually completely change the way you make decisions. So to give you an example of this, and forgive me, Janelle, this is going to be an old economy, I like that, not even conventional, old economy way of thinking about it. I'm going to be very generous right now. We're going to do a little experiment. Let's imagine it's 100 years old, 100 years ago. It's 100 years ago, and I give you all in this room £1,000. Okay? It's 100 years ago, I've given you all £1,000 with one condition. You either invest that money in a company that makes cars or a company that makes horses. Where would you invest, expecting a return, where would you invest your £1,000 100 years ago, cars or horses? Who are the car people? Any horse people around here? Yeah, be honest. Yeah? See, it's interesting, isn't it? It's not cut and dried because it's 100 years ago. And let's try to understand why it's not cut and dried. Right? Well, but we'll compare those two technologies side by side, shall we? Now let's start with the horse. It's a pretty good technology. Right? You grew up with the horse. It's very reliable. You know, it generally starts every morning, except for the one morning when it doesn't start, but you know it's probably not going to start again. And on that note, it's biodegradable. It runs off biofuels that you can often grow yourself in the back paddock. It's pretty awesome. It's got a lovely user interface. It's got this great autopilot feature. If you've had one too many drinks, it can probably take you home. You know, driverless horses. You know, and indeed, it's widely affordable. Generally, you can afford a horse if you want a horse, right? And widely available. So that's a pretty good technology. It's the dominant technology of the time. Let's compare that 100 years ago to the car, right? 100 years ago, the car was very different from the car today. It was smelly. It was unreliable. It generally wouldn't start on a cold day, right? And even if you had to get it started, you know, you'd be doing a crank or whatever it might be, and the horse had this little rear leg problem they were trying to work out, but the car had a crank problem, you know? It was unfamiliar. You had to learn an entirely new user interface. It was generally not that affordable. It was generally not that available. The horse was great. It was cross-country. You had to drive on these things called roads with your car. You actually, where the horse could eat biofuel, the car, you had to buy this stuff called petrol from inconvenient locations that you otherwise weren't going to go to. And even more interesting, and this is this whole question around, you know, structures, the horse lobby and the car lobby were actually in a battle, believe it or not, a very vicious battle, you might say, because what was happening is that the horse lobby was actually getting all these rules in place to stop car ownership and to stop car ownership. They were things called driver's licenses. Believe it or not. I mean, this is why there's such a thing called the NRMA. The NRMA, a cooperative, was generally created to fight back against the horse lobby. Right? And the horse lobby was successful. It was getting driver's licenses and speed limits when they came out. You couldn't even drive a car faster than you could ride a horse. Right? If you're in Arizona, this is an amazing thing. 100 years ago, if you're in Arizona, there was a law that said if you are driving a car and you see somebody riding a horse, you had to pull over to the side of the road and turn off that car so you didn't frighten the dear thing, right? And so the horse would pass, and then you had to start it up again if you were able to, right? That's why if 100 years ago, if you were asked, well, what's going to be better, a horse or a car? Probably a lot of folk would, of course, said, yeah, the horse. You know, this newfangled car, I don't get it, I'll never drive one. But why? But it's interesting that what I've done there, you know, but of course, you know, 100 years later, we know that if you invest your money in General Motors, the return would have been greater than General Horse Co. In fact, General Horse Co. does not quite exist, right? Why is that? Well, because, and coming back to my original thought, time frames matter. Right? What I did then, it was actually just a little bit of trick. I actually made that decision in a very narrow time frame, right? Just compared them at 2 points in time. Let's look at the question a bit differently. Let's look at the technology trajectory of those two things. Right? The horse, right? The horse was invented, I don't know, 100 million years ago, whatever it might. Its technology trajectory was like this, you know, flat, 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 flat. We domesticated the horse. Right, got a bit of a boom. We created horseshoes and saddles and a whole lot of things, right? But we're getting to 100 years ago. Its technology trajectory is completely flat. That horse was not going to get that much better until we get those, you know, genetically engineered super horses they've been promising us for years, right? But basically, the technology trajectory of the horse was like that. The car, on the other hand, its technology trajectory was like this, right? Every couple of years, it was improving in terms of reliability, in terms of performance, in terms of price. And basically, if you made your decision based on where's that technology going versus where's that technology going, you'd probably have a good idea. And this requires us all to look in a bit of a broader time frame, right? Over the next 10 years or 20 years, you probably could have said, you know what, the car is going to overtake the horse in that amount of time. And what's really fascinating is we often fall into that trap when we're thinking about innovation, when we think about change, of just looking at things as they are today, right? And you say, okay, and in fact, you know, we're starting to see this change right now, which is great, but even the car, the internal combustion engine, right now, compared to, say, the electric vehicle, right? The internal combustion engine's been on this lovely plateau where it hasn't really improved that much. The electric vehicle, of course, it's been increasing in efficiency, performance, in price for quite a while. You can pretty much see where that one's going. So thinking about timeframes probably leads me into saying that that Tim mentioned earlier, and this is where I did a lot of work when I was at CSIRO, and also the book that I wrote, was really trying to understand, and it's really fascinating that since the Industrial Revolution, the moment when we actually did start to separate economic growth from labour. Because before that, if you wanted more tables, you needed more people to make more tables. If you wanted more food, you needed more people to make more food, so you needed more people that required more food, and so on, right? The Industrial Revolution was basically when we separated those two things. But since then, we've actually had what they call 5 long waves of innovation. So it hasn't just been constant levels of progress, it's actually been this period of what they call upswings and downswings. And at the upswing, what happens is you get a lot of disruption, you get a lot of change, a lot of new businesses, and particularly a lot of new business models that start to emerge. Right? These business models can be anything from, matrix organizations to networks to whatever it might be. Then you get along towards the top of a wave of innovation, and they start to say what they call emerging, dominant designs emerge. Right? And these dominant designs can be things like AC Power, they can be things like Microsoft Windows. Right? Dominant design emerge. And at the end of a wave of innovation, what you get is a global depression. And this here is a really interesting slide, and for me really compelling, because it's basically the S&P 500 index, so it's a proxy for the stock exchange for the last 200 years. Right? And you can't really see the first wave of innovation. That was the steam milling wave, because of course we didn't really have a stock exchange in place at that stage. But what you can start to see, it was a bit bumpy, but look at those last two in particular. You can see ever since the Great Depression, and the transition point between the 4th and the 5th was fascinating because it wasn't very deep, it was quite long. It was called the oil shocks in the 70s. But what's really fascinating, and this is some work that was actually done by Allianz, believe it or not, is I think that the jury is fairly much out now that basically the GFC, the global financial crisis, was the transition from one wave of innovation to the next. And why is that important? Well, it's important because what it means is, and the next 10 years, right, the upswing periods, it basically means we're entering an upswing period. And the upswing periods are when lots and lots of change starts to occur. The downswing period, nothing much changes, right? Think about the noughties, right? The big brands that were there at the beginning of the noughties were all still sort of there at the end of the noughties, your Googles and your Amazons and whatever. But what's happened in the last couple of years? We're starting to see new models changing, and we've already heard reference of the Ubers and the Airbnbs and the collaborative economy and all those sorts of things start to change. That is absolutely a canary in the coal mine that basically you're seeing, when you start seeing big global brands emerge, you absolutely know that you're towards the beginning of a wave of innovation. And so what it really means is that basically now is the period where we can disrupt stuff. Now is the period that you can actually change things, because it's actually after a global financial crisis that people and businesses and individuals and governments are all starting to say, maybe we should learn from our mistakes. Maybe, who knows? But basically they're looking for new models, new ways of deploying capital or finding ways of organising or whatever it might be in order to get change. So now is the period to change. The other thing that's really interesting, and I'm not going to go, it's going to be hard to sort of dig into all the different bits, but basically what becomes really fascinating is what happens if you can actually predict what some of those changes might be. Either as an individual, as a business, as a government, whatever it might be, what happens if you can start to understand what those changes are? And of course, prediction is a very dangerous game. Generally predictions are all wrong, so you need to ignore everything that I'm saying after this moment. But basically, it's the same with the horse and the car. Where are these technology trends starting to go? And that's probably about as far as you can get in terms of understanding what's happening. But one of the interesting things, and I guess this was one of the major sort of conclusions that I came to from the work that we were doing, and this is where it starts to really, I think, intersect very much with the creative economy, is that basically one of the biggest changes that we saw was effectively this convergence, that actually until now, we've had two very separate worlds, the world of information, the world of knowledge, and often the world of resources. Right? If you think about the internet before BI, before internet, right? Effectively, we were doing things very, very manually. The internet came along, and what we did is we actually started using that pretty simply to remove transaction costs. The last wave of innovation was just, how do I buy a book more quickly? How do I book a flight more cheap, more quickly, more effectively? It was all about reducing transaction costs. But what's really interesting, and one of the deep things that we started to see, was that basically the next wave, or the next 30 years, is potentially going to be a change of all that. It's going to be the time when we actually start to take all this stuff. In fact, a short way of saying it's basically intelligent, taking things like that chair or whatever it might be, making it more intelligent, more interconnected, and more instrumented. And what does that mean? It basically means that every single thing over the next 30 years in the natural world eventually has a digital counterpart, right? Whether it's that light switch over there, whether it's that bottle over there, whether it's this building, whether it's me, everything starts to have a digital version. That light switch becomes connected to the smart grid. That bottle starts to have a little radio frequency tag saying, I'm a bottle, right? And it knows whether it's full or not. The building has got a building management system. It already has a building management system that's controlling the lights and probably knows how many people are in here already, right? And I, of course, have my digital version. It's called my mobile phone. And that thing knows a huge amount about me. It knows where I am. You know, eventually it's going to be my wallet and my keys. It's probably going to be monitoring my heartbeat so it knows whether I'm alive or not. Hopefully call somebody if I'm not, you know. But basically everything in the digital world will have, everything in the natural world will have a digital counterpart. And the reason why that's interesting is because basically it starts to really shape or reshape the way we think about stuff. You know, our very connection with technology is changing, right? This is fascinating. I mean, the interesting thing about technology, we don't think about it. It's been sneaking up on us, right? Like in the olden days, right? It used to be the television in the corner of the room, right? And then somehow it snuck onto our desks, right? It became the desktop, and then it's gone onto my lap, right? Now it's in my pocket. Now it's on my wrist. It's touching me. Congratulations, technology, Apple. You've actually got to touch me now, all the time, right? Eventually, it probably will be plugged in. Right? That's what's starting to happen, and because of that happening, our entire relationship with technology, the way we can start to use it, is being shaped. What's even more interesting is we're actually starting to see that the digital world is coming back into the natural world in really interesting ways. Has anyone heard of this company, Magic Leap? How many people here have heard of Magic Leap? This is half of this stuff is sort of exciting and also scary at the same time, I must say. You know, Magic Leap is a company that's basically what it's doing is some ophthalmologists, some very clever ophthalmologists and other people are getting together and they're trying to work out a way of effectively projecting stuff into people's eyeballs, right? And their goal is to be able to put your mobile phone or whatever on the table. They're very secretive. Now this company, mind you, has already received over $1 billion worth of investment from Google and others, which is crazy. But basically, they want to be able to project stuff into your eyeball because, as they say, the human brain is still the best display ever made. Right? Because effectively, it's just photons impacting themselves upon these little photoreceptors called your eyes. And if they can basically project stuff straight into your eyes, well, then you do get the very happy children with the floating horseshoe, seahorse, having education, right? That stuff, now that's a company that's got $1 billion from Google to try to reach their ambition. And it really starts to say that digital world, what's going to happen when that starts to come into the natural world? The other thing that's really fascinating, and this sort of starts coming into also the big challenges and why some of these changes have to occur is because when we start to see that digital and natural world combine and when things start to become more instrumented, intelligent and interconnected, they also become a lot more smart. And we're already starting to see the shift occur. Shifts in the labour market always come with these large waves of innovation. But the most interesting shift, this was some work that was done by Oxford University, which had a go at trying to understand exactly what was the chance that a job was going to be computerised to 2030, right? So this is only 15 years ago. I've got 2 young boys. This is sort of around the time when they're going to graduate school, right? Just after. And what this study found was that basically if you look at a high chance of being computerized, roles being computerized, so this is what they call, either robotics or artificial intelligence, 47% of current US jobs are potentially going to be computerized by around about 2030. And indeed, and again, you start saying, well, what does that actually mean for society? And we can probably talk about that, because I think that we need to think about what this means for society and how employment is going to shape and how the very nature of what we do as a society is going to be changed. But just imagine, this isn't even across, often in ways of innovation, we change labour markets across generation, right? We don't have a typing pool anymore, right? That happened across generations. This is happening within a generation. And it's also happening across almost every single discipline you can possibly imagine. And the ones where we've got a lot of employment, transportation, production, installation, and all the ones down the bottom are the ones that are most likely to, unfortunately, disappear. Of course, there's also some very good news about this stuff, that the sort of square models, the linear models, as you might think about it, are all going to start to change. Linear models were very much ones where you're digging stuff out of the ground, turning it into something and then chucking it back in the ground at its end of life. If we start to see the digital and the natural worlds converge, well, suddenly we're getting more information about resources than we've ever had before. We can actually start to work out business models where, hey, you know what? This company is producing this stuff. There's a company in Canada that worked out, for example, that it was a beer company. It was a beer company that basically had a lot of grain waste, right? They huge amounts of grain waste, of course, as you make beer, right? And you can't do much with that grain waste. But you know what they found? You can actually grow shiitake mushrooms on it, right? So they could actually, it suddenly became a beer company and a shiitake mushroom company. But the good news was that the shiitake mushrooms changed the grain waste so they could now sell it as fish food. So it became a beer, shiitake mushroom and fish food company. And then somebody else could use the fish food to grow fish and it's all that sort of thing. So what they found was that basically, rather than having a very linear business, which was then getting rid of the grain waste, they're actually starting to close the entire loop, right, around their production, where basically waste becomes unsellable production. If you're making something and wasting it, well, you're actually just making two things, the thing you need and the thing you don't need. Work out how to do something with both of them. And that's effectively what they call the circular economy. So what I've hopefully given you is a sense that basically, yes, things are about to change very significantly, that we are in the transition point between one wave of innovation and the next. But what does that actually really mean for cooperatives? What does that really mean for mutuals? And for me, the big take home is that basically it means that they're going to be well placed for change, because effectively, even though many cooperatives and mutuals have been around for a long time and they've been very successful, and I don't know, Melina, what's the percentage of Australians who are a member of one? I think it's a ridiculous 79% of Australians are actually members of a cooperative or mutual. Very successful. What's interesting, though, is, as we just heard from Janelle, basically the opportunities set is probably going to expand quite significantly for a whole lot of businesses and a whole lot of areas that we haven't seen before. And I think that's because of two reasons. The first is that basically we're starting to see the power of platforms emerge. And this is a little bit of work done by a guy called Jeremy Hymans. He's an Australian. He was one of the guys who helped set up GetUp over here, now over in the US. And he published a thing in HBR, which he talked about in terms of new power. And what I found was really fascinating and really cool about this model is they put forward a very compelling argument that the old model of organising, the old model of organising was all about control and controlling all the assets, right? The old model of organising where, you say you were GE, you needed to actually own and control every single bit. The old model of organising is basically starting to become disrupted by a very new model of organising, one where you're not creating control, but instead you're just providing a platform for things to interact together. And they started to say, okay, what are actually the different types of platforms? And you get into the end, as you can see here, their thesis is that basically co-owning is the pinnacle of all of that. But basically, consuming to sharing, shaping, funding, and producing, and so on. Basically, that model, and this is where technology becomes a big enabler, because if you have to, it's very hard to actually build some of these new models if the flows of knowledge, or indeed the flows of materials, and I'll get into that in a second, are really difficult. But cooperatives, of course, start to come into that space. The other thing that I think is really interesting, and this is the other, this entire journey of waves of innovation has actually been a journey of extracting more value out of stuff. That's the other way you can think about it. We started off, and our value that we created was actually all about commodities, right? We dug out stuff out of the ground, and we were, growing stuff, or we were digging holes to get ores or whatever it might be. It was all about commodities, right? That's where, in the first couple of waves of innovation, the richest in the world were the folk who found oil from Texas or whatever it might be. But very soon, what we realized is the real value to be extracted was actually the people who turned commodities into products. Right? If you can compose, and this is now we're getting into the third and fourth wave of innovation, if you can compose, raw iron ore into iron and then turn it into a dishwasher, you're going to do really well. But what happened in the fifth wave, we started to learn something else that's interesting. If you compose commodities into products and you compose products, where do you get more value? You compose products into services. Right? People might want, what do you want? Do you want the iPhone? Or do you actually want the phone call? Right? There's a lot more value in the phone call than there is in the iPhone. And indeed, Apple's real brilliance was actually saying, well, there's even more value in not just the phone call, but all the stuff you could start to build. It's the App Store. Right? The true value in this thing is the App Store and the ecosystem they created. It's the services that you build. But what gets really fascinating is this, and you can see, hopefully, that the world economy has been shifting into putting more value into these areas. What if commodities get composed into products and products get composed into services, what does services get composed into? Where does the value lie? Now, anyone want to have a go? Experiences. Right? Experiences are composition of services. And again, folk in the creative economy probably get this better than anyone else. Right? That indeed, it's often, how do you pull apart that set of that experience into sets of, airlines also get this, right? It's not about the plane, it's not about the product, it's not even about getting from A to B, which is the service, it's about the entire experience. Now, this is why Qantas and Virgin, they want to be able to check in really quickly, right? Why Etihad, if you're flying business class, apparently they'll actually pick you up in a black car to take you to the airport because they understand that the experience of the journey starts from the moment you leave your home. And they're trying to make that entire experience. It's a composition of services. But here's the really interesting thing. If indeed, again, commodities compose into products, products into services, services into experience, what do experiences compose into? Meaning. And indeed, if you think about it, that's where, and this is the companies are basically very much trying to work out, Airbnb, for example, it's belonging. Right? They're trying to say, how do we tap into meaning? Why are we here? This is the Simon Sinek thing. Some of you may have seen the TED Talk. People don't buy what you do, they buy why you do what you do. And I think really the interesting, this is almost like a hierarchy of needs, but indeed for value in terms of what organisations, companies, co-ops, mutuals might be. Basically, they're all about trying to understand where they sit on that particular set. But basically the thing is we're finding that the higher up you sit, the more sticky your business becomes. This gets me basically, so that's why we ended up building the entire company around the company that I'm running at the moment, because we basically said, we want to be a delivery service. Our purpose is to help good businesses deliver. We came out of a two-share, I don't know where Tim is, basically, oh, there he is. Basically, Tim used two-share, right? It was a sharing platform, right, that was actually helping people. We found that basically the biggest pain there was getting stuff from one person to another, right? And that was basically the whole incentive of helping things to get delivered and making it easy. But also understanding that it's actually the platform you build to make that happen that makes it cost-effective and cheap. So hopefully I've given you sort of a sense, and for me this is why cooperatives and mutuals are very well placed, because what's the two things that are at the very DNA, I think, of a cooperative or a mutual? Well, one, their purpose. They exist for a purpose, right? They're not existing for shareholder return or whatever. They're actually existing for a higher purpose, for helping folk to bargain better or whatever it might be. But also what's interesting is that they're basically generally, by their very nature, potentially built as platforms. Platforms of the ways to organise, platforms of ways to market, platforms of ways to actually make decisions in more distributed ways that are probably, hopefully more robust. And this is getting to the point that these platforms can generally be much more efficient than others. I think the final thing, though, is that, this is my last thing, the big message in all of this is that we are experiencing a period of change, and theoretically, hopefully, it's going to be those organisations that can change the quickest, can adapt the fastest, are going to be the ones that succeed the best. In the old, there's a new expression I just say, it's no longer the big that eat the small, it's the fast that eat the slow, right? And because the thing that we're also seeing about these waves of innovation is things are accelerating very, very quickly. So hoping that's given you all a sense of where I see the future going, why I think that there's a lot of power in terms of the values that basically are written into the very DNA of cooperatives and mutuals around purpose and platform. And I'm very much looking forward to our conversation. Thank you.
Am I on, Mr. Music? So, James, thank you for that. I want you to take a seat. I touched him. And I wonder if I can get the panel up. So, yeah, James and I are a safe distance from each other. I think that's healthy at this stage for our respective partners and our children. So if I can welcome back Janelle, who we've met before, but I also want to introduce, along with Peter Tregilgas, Melina Morrison and Nuno Silva. We're going to try to do something that boys in particular aren't good at, which is two things at the same time. We're going to have a conversation up here, and if there are questions that you have, can you tweet them to me by using Creatives Get Mutual? And we'll just see if I can do two things at once. We've got about 25 minutes, or actually looking at the weather out there, I think we've probably got about 7 days. So I think we should hunker in and get really comfortable with each other. If anyone's ever seen Key Largo as the movie, I think that's a fantastic black and white. Tension rises, it all sort of falls apart at a certain point. See if that happens or not. Anyway, thank you very much, everybody. The two faces that we haven't met, I wanted to throw to first, actually. Melina Morrison is the CEO of the Business Council of Cooperatives and Mutuals, and has come from leading a campaign that I watched with great interest in 2011 into 2012, which was the International Year of Cooperatives. And for me, that was in some ways a rebranding, a bringing back of something that we needed to hear again. And I think we've been hearing today is the maturing of an idea of how those working in the collaborative economy may arrive at structures that are trusted, that exist. And Janelle, I want to come back to you on this one. So before I throw to Melina on her reflections, I also want to introduce Nuno Silva, who's a successful commercial photographer all the way from Canada. Nuno, we haven't had the chance to say this, but my name's Tim Horton, and in Canada, it's the only place you don't go for coffee because it's quite dreadful.
I was about to make a really bad joke about that.
Right, yeah. Great donuts, I think. Ice hockey star, coked up, drove his Ferrari off a bridge, I think, 1974. Post-mortem was never done. I was born 73. There's something in that. I just don't know what it is. Nuno, we'll come to you as well to talk about Stocksy, which is a really interesting platform, very similar to those we've been hearing. Melina, throwing to you. In terms of reflections that you've been hearing both from Janelle and from James, is this the sort of thing that you are seeing? Is there a mature discussion around this in Australia at the moment?
In terms of the resurgence in cooperatives?
Yeah, and the structures that people can rely on. There are things going through my mind around how creatives can anticipate that circular economy, that fantastic example of the value chain that sits behind it, and how people could self-organise into creating a value chain and take out the middleman, which appears to be the logic behind cooperatives and mutuals.
Well, for me, one thing that really jumped out, apart from the fact that is this the Coopolis actually happening now? Because it's very apocalyptic what's happening outside, is James, what you were saying in terms of the incredible opportunities around the next wave of technology and innovation, digital transformation, how critical the question of ownership is. It just came up in my mind so many times with the examples that you gave, that we have an amazing opportunity to colonise for ourselves, for people, this digital transformation that might otherwise see more of our resources as individuals taken to service the needs of smaller and smaller numbers of people. So the imperative for me, really, in hearing the discussion is putting ownership back on the agenda. Is that happening in a mature conversation in Australia? In some markets it is. So if you think of the big discussion around moving from the mining boom to the dining boom, there is a discussion around how do producers extract more value back from the market supply chain for their production. And that's about finding platforms in which smaller market entrants can compete in markets that favour global or larger players. And once again, that's a platform question, but it's also an ownership question. I don't think we've started the conversation with the creative sector much yet. But talking about waves of innovation and change, disruption or points of crisis, as we're seeing around arts funding, for example, are great places to insert a model like cooperatives back into the conversation and say, how can we use this to resolve the crisis issue, which is about having people find a way to address their needs. At the same time, embracing the most exciting things that are happening with technological innovation. I think this is the major challenge for the cooperative sector. In making the old new, we do have to solve this issue about how we innovate, thanks James, quickly enough to take, the time frame's now. The model's there, the time frame's now.
Listening to James, I started to wonder if the future will be trademarked, and in that context, how does the creative sector in particular assert itself? And I think maybe it's a difference between the science and innovation, the patent-oriented perspective on startup, product, invest, growth. There's a little bit of Kool-Aid happening at the moment in the startup space around conceive it, design it, build it, sell it. That does sort of come with this idea of a trademark somewhere along the way. Janelle, you're working with people to subvert that. And the thing I want to ask you in particular is, we've just had the last 10 years being told that we are all disintermediating, and yet it seems there are still middlemen in there, middlemen who are trademarked. So can we circumvent in the event that the future is trademarked? Can we share? There are mechanisms for it. They're legal structures. How do they work?
Yeah. I think that we need to start with the things that we can take back. I think a lot of things have just become enclosed, again, to use like the words, of the commons. A lot of intellectual property has been enclosed, as I mentioned, land and water, but things like our labor and our infinite creativity, we still own that. And so organizing around that first, I think, is a good step. I'm not sure if I totally understood the question, but feel free to say more.
No, fair enough. It was probably the way the question was phrased. James?
I was just going to say, I think the creative economy also needs to, is moving up that hierarchy that I talked about as well. It used to be good enough to have a good, I'd probably call it a service, or maybe even a product. Let's call it the song, say, right? But what we're seeing, and we were just having a conversation earlier, is you look at most breakthrough artists or whatever these days, and not just about the music, right? It's fascinating. It's about their following and their purpose and their meaning, and Lady Gaga's doing this or whatever. It's like basically it's the whole, interesting. They're moving up as well in that hierarchy, and I think that's probably the opportunity for the whole creative sector as well. This is where you get back, right? If you're trying to compete lower down, it's very hard to compete with these big machines that are sort of churning through things in efficiency. You've got to play higher. And that's the thing that the good news is that's what motivates people as well, is the purpose concept, is the loconomics thing. It's actually, they're really trying to tap into purpose as opposed to how do we beat TaskRabbit, because TaskRabbit's probably got a big, head start. Okay, well, we've got to be playing, if TaskRabbit's playing at the task level, the service level, let's play at the purpose level, and then we can beat them.
Especially hard. So in architecture, 98% of architectural firms are SMEs, employ less than 19 people. How you devote time or resources to thinking of tomorrow, let alone just dealing with the invoices today, is really hard. Again, this seems to be where co-ops come from, which is if we were to share some of the infrastructure around that, then we might all be able to share some of that thinking into the future. Again, Janelle, and then to Nuno, examples from California or the US where by sharing they're able to get ahead. Is there anything in that?
Oh gosh, yeah. Lately I feel like everything I do just works better if I share. I don't know, I work in a shared workspace. I've lived in shared housing. I don't know, it kind of feels like not only does it make everything easier, it just makes everything more interesting and rewarding. I don't know.
And so, Nuno, tell us about Stocksy. Reflections on what you've heard from Janelle and James as well, and then introduce us to Stocksy and tell us how that works and how does the sharing benefit those who are involved?
Right. So, Janelle's presentation really resonated with me and with Stocksy, because a lot of the reasons why we started Stocksy, she mentioned. Our industry is generally run by investors and VCs who control, the product, and they take the profit away from the artists. And what we did is we decided to turn that around and make our artists co-op owners. And the result of that, through that profit sharing and through the transparency of information and how the business is run, our artists are actually producing better quality product for us. And so we've been able to become very successful by empowering and sharing with our artists. And it also is, for what James mentioned about timeframes, we came at the right time when artist royalties were becoming lesser and lesser and lesser, and the product was suffering. I think back in 2012, 2013, stock photos were a cliche. They were kind of pretty awful. And so we wanted to change that, and we thought that the best way to do that was to put more power and more money to the hands of the artist. And so we started the cooperative.
Am I right that part of it is also, there's an element of mentoring as well, isn't there? So again, isn't this about helping them lift up
Very
the
much
value
so,
chain?
yeah.
So
We purposely limited our membership in the very first year. We only accepted 500 artists because we wanted it to be a very sustainable business. We wanted every artist in there to be successful. We wanted them to share in our vision to better the product as a whole. And so we kept the membership very, very small. We have very, very close relationships with all our artists. They're involved in all the business decisions, and we give them in return a lot of business intelligence. We tell them what our buyers are looking for, what the aesthetic trends are, and we do have this community that's growing. Even here in Australia, part of the reason why I'm here is to start Australian localization, and that's just not looking for buyers. That's looking at our artists here in Australia and trying to get them to work together, to communicate together, to better themselves and better their craft.
But Janelle, is that also what you do? Are you also a mentor and counsellor to co-ops and not-for-profits? How do we do this? You know what I mean? I imagine that communities come in and say, we know what we want to do and we've seen others do it.
Yeah.
So are you mentoring
Right.
as well?
Yeah, well, I calculated I've advised about 350 clients in the last 9 years, most of whom are either cooperatives or nonprofits, or they're just purpose-driven organizations, whatever form they take. And they just take an infinite variety of forms, and I've never found that there's like a perfect formula for any of them. And I think what it tells me is that it's just going to be infinitely diverse, and we really need to engage much more nuanced understandings of how people work and how we make decisions together and how we relate. And so I am a mentor, I guess, in that respect, that I've now been exposed to so many clients, and I've seen what works and what doesn't, but there's still so much. I mean, there's so much we've not even tried yet. And technology cooperatives, like I was just talking to Nuno earlier, they're much further along than Loconomics, our client, is. So I'm just like, what's working, How do you guys have meetings with all those members, And there's a lot to learn.
And isn't that part of it? I mean, so I joked about the coming back to the Cooperatives Business School. Isn't that some of it? So at the moment, UTS has a really good thing called the Hatchery, where it takes young people with ideas and gets them through a process that is rigorous about developing the idea, testing the idea, sanity testing the idea, etc., putting them in touch with the venture capitalists to see if the idea's got some backing, etc. So does this happen? Do we have this for co-ops? Do we need this for co-ops? Janelle, do you do it? Or Melina, is the Business Council thinking of it, or do you provide it?
That question is fantastic. That's the education question. So we've just had a Senate inquiry into cooperatives and mutuals, and it basically said 3 things. You need to enable, to get the growth of this business model, you need regulatory change, you need recognition, which I'll now call the green velour tracksuit principle, which is that you need ministers for cooperatives and sons of ministers of
Yep.
co-ops,
Yep.
and you need
daughters,
education.
yeah.
But education, we need to be back at the beginning. So when we're born and we go to school and we start to learn about enterprise in primary school, probably in creche, in play school, or start playing kids Monopoly, this is just another way of doing business. Like, let's not complicate it. It's a very old form, it's a new form, it's the original peer-to-peer lending, it's the original sharing economy, if you like. It's just not in the mix. And I think of my Money Saver account with the Commonwealth Bank. You know, that's an exposure very, very early on as a child to a banking system. You know, so there are credit unions out there as well delivering financial services, but it's not coming into play. Further up the chain, as the Senate inquiry showed, if you're a practicing lawyer, accountant, if you graduate with a commerce or business degree or a master's or you have a doctorate, you may not have done 1 hour, 1 minute of cooperative or mutual business studies as part of that course. So it's just crazy. You know, there are 2,000 cooperatives and mutuals in Australia. That's the same number as ASX-listed companies. We're just missing in action. So we need to get back. We need to redress that and get the business model just back into the curriculum as a, you know, prima facie sort of, you know, principle. But it just needs to be part of the diversity of business models. It's not just about saying it's all cooperatives or it's all listed companies or it's all, you know, social enterprises. It's a diverse economy, is more robust and less volatile. And so how do we expose people to the business model?
So one way seems to be to share, at a very basic level, to share the stories and experiences of those who are doing it and doing it well. I know that you were behind stories.coop. Keen for those with the phones to go to stories.coop, which again just shares the stories of those involved in cooperatives, mutuals and sort of collaborative arrangements. A favourite, when I was seeing it, it had a parallel in the UK for me, which is the Compendium for the Civic Economy, which carries David Cameron's signature. It says, government can't do everything. We need to start doing things for ourselves. It's got a rationale to it. But the idea of these stories that shows that it's as much about food as it is a lending library, as it is a lunch club, as it is a breakfast thing for kids. So there are many complexions to it. I guess the idea of that shared infrastructure and a maturing of the sector by relying on some, forgive me, but almost template structures. At a very basic level, they're all different, but there are some things around how do we meet? How do we vote? What do we vote on? How much can we take out? I thought that was really, really interesting. Nuno, how do you vote? What was your answer?
That's one of our biggest technological challenges. Our co-op has global members, which has all kinds of implications with time zones and language, and so we've had to adapt. I think we're in our 4th year now. It hasn't been easy. There's been a lot of technological failures, but we're getting there. We've built a co-op portal that's in our site. Members are able to submit resolutions that are reviewed by the board, and then they're put up on the site. We call general meetings online, and the meeting takes as long as it takes to accumulate the vote. So we've started to adapt using the rules, the co-op rules and structures that are placed in our province. But at the same time, they're also listening and watching us carefully to see how they're learning to the new, adapting to the new realities of a global economy. And it's really communicating with our membership has probably been the biggest challenge, and we're trying to fix that with technology.
So there's a question from Sharon Eade, which is a rather big one. Are we facing the end of economic growth as we know it? And how can cooperatives help us adapt? James, to you.
Look, thanks, Sharon. Good question. I don't think we're seeing the end of economic growth. I think that we want growth. Okay, it's dependent on what the measure is of that growth. Right? I don't want to go back and live 100 years ago. Frankly, like 100 years ago, I'd probably be dead because I've had my appendix out, for starters. But sanitation's poor, right? There'd be, I think I read somewhere, actually, go back 200 years ago, and you look at the average person in a Western society, compare them to the King of England 200 years ago, and they basically have got better food, better sanitation, better entertainment, better mobility, You name it, like pretty much, most people sitting in this room have got it better than the King of England 200 years ago. So there's nothing wrong for me around progress and growth, right? And but basically, if you can see from that graph, generally been measuring that in terms of dollars, right? And that's because actually there's been a strong coupling effectively between technological progress and dollars. The really interesting thing that starts to happen, and again, The Economist wrote about this about a month ago, is we're definitely seeing that as we automate stuff, the previous way of creating growth, you might say, which was dig something out of the ground, add value to it, the dollars that the amount of value added was a measure of the dollars and so on, that's starting to unravel a bit because we're either going into the circular economy where things start to get circulated all over. You think about jobs, if we're all in a service world, what is a job? A job's pretty well defined if you're spending hours converting, grain into flour or whatever it might be, you're adding value. But actually, we could be sitting here and you could be paying me to speak for you and I could be paying you to listen, right? And we've all got a job. Right? That's really a weird sort of service thing, right? So in the services world, even jobs and value that you're creating become really interesting. And so I think the answer is not that we're going to not want to grow. There will always be some sort of probable measure of progress. And, I was on the board of the Bureau of Statistics, and there's this whole things where they called subjective well-being, and you can sort of measure economies or whatever it might be. We'll always want growth. I think the really interesting thing is we're seeing that the economic growth being very much decoupled from the stuff that it was coupled to before. Because it used to be coupled to resource extraction, we're seeing that decoupling. It used to be decoupled from to labour. That's definitely being decoupled even more strongly at the moment, particularly as we automate labour. What's really interesting is it's still probably quite firmly coupled to intellectual property. Right? There's that which is getting into the creative space. In fact, if you decouple resources and you decouple labour, that's all that's left is intellectual property, which comes to the whole, trademarking or whatever it might be space. So that world's changing, but I don't think it's necessarily the end of economic growth as we.
Lena.
I just wanted to add one thing to what James is saying, that when I look at the growth question, the big question is how you share the risks and rewards of that growth or that innovation or development. The big question we haven't faced, and Janelle put the statistics up on the screen and we hear them all the time, so we know we're going to a casualised labour market. So the future of work is going to be really interesting. We've got this huge disparity between the sharing of the growth and the risks that are created to sustain that growth. And for countries, that is a systemic risk. It's one of the leading causes of concern for global leaders when they turn up to Davos nowadays, is to talk about income disparity and other signs of inequality are a major global security risk, as is climate change, etc. So how do we do that to cope with growth? How do we share risks and rewards equitably in a way that can sustain us?
According to the cartoon, we get rid of the middleman and we regard the workers as shareholders. And I think that's we need to find a way to wrap up. Of course, there's a screen up here that just went red and there's a certain point where they throw things at us. But I wonder if I can, between Melina first, sorry, there's a couple of questions that I would love answered that we don't have time for. So let's just take them somewhere, maybe in the session we're going to be bunking down in the next week. One is, I think, from Chris, what role does blockchain play in the future of cooperatives? Fascinating question. Mm-hmm. And I know one from Lisa Colley as well, who's doing work with the City of Sydney on what the success factors are around cooperative work. I think as we are ushered out of here, these are things that we might explore. But Melina, first to you. We are in an election. Top 3 things that our leaders need to know, and then Peter to close it out.
Well, for the policymakers here, you can help us make it as easy to set up and run a cooperative as other forms of enterprise, and that's to do with regulation. So if we can do that in a couple of years. There's 17 great recommendations out of the Senate inquiry, and if we address those, we can enable the cooperative form. And Janelle listed them. You know, it's the public policy, it's the financial. Capital issues, etc. So that's the main thing, and recognition. You know, using your role again. This is a sort of election policy pitch. Using your role as thought leaders, change makers, or policy makers to make sure that you include cooperative model when you're designing economic and social policy. So that's there. It's available.
Thank you, Peter. You opened this. Did we give you what you wanted?
There's so much more to be done. The issue, of course, is people. Janelle put it so well about people power. I find it really interesting that there's an advertising campaign by the current government talking about innovation. The role of arts is about innovation. It's also about small business. Most of us are involved in small operations connecting to the bigger companies. The point here is, where is the no-brainer about the arts support and that role? And we have a task to be done to bring ourselves together to make and manage our own markets. That is the role for cooperatives and platform cooperatives, and it's been so eloquently presented today. Thank you so much for James. Thank you, Melina, for being here and supporting the program. Thank you so much, Janelle, for your insights, and for the unique scenario of having an international guest who literally turned up, who is the model. I think that we'll all pop down to the cafe for a quick coffee for those that haven't had the chance. And finally, chance to catch up. Janelle is going to have to go within an hour because we have another appointment for her. Finally, thank you, Tim, bringing all that together, and only 3 minutes and 45 seconds late. So thank you very much. Thank you all.
So stay following the hashtag too. So the last piece of advice Peter gave me before we came to stage was that I do all the hashtaggy shit. So I am. So Creatives Get Mutual will stay active. There's an event tomorrow, obviously, a workshop delving into more detail. And then there's an event in Melbourne as well coming up. So stay tuned. Thanks all.